Hello. Last year, there was an article in Newsweek called What Progressives Need to Learn About America from the Immigrants They Welcome by Zaid Jilani. It was eventually brought to my attention because the article linked to my own 2019 piece for Quillette, Orcophobia, Our Western Self-Hatred. Jilani's article was a good one, but as a side point, it maintained that orcophobia, cultural self-hatred, is more severe in the United States than in Europe. According to polling on each continent, a much larger proportion of, for example, German leftists than American leftists are proud of their country. That is, the gulf between leftists and rightists regarding patriotism seemed less wide in Europe than here in the United States, and Europeans seemed less self-hating. And it has, of course, become a cliche that the United States is extremely polarized and tearing itself apart. The ferocity of the political struggle between conservatives and progressives appears to be greater here than anywhere else in the West. But while American conservatives and progressives keep at each other's throats, Europeans seem relatively mild and placid. And in fact, this is the case. But the principal reason for this, on a broad historical level, has been poorly understood. And the impression that Americans are more self-hating or orcophobic than Europeans is incorrect. The polling that Jilani cites is misleading, and it shows how insufficient it is to understand a culture by numbers alone, and how it is necessary to be steeped in a culture, both academically and personally, in order truly to understand it. This is a point I made in my recent article, Why America is Still the Freest Country. In this instance, one must understand that different people mean different things, even while uttering the very same sentence, such as, I am proud of my country. What do people actually mean when they say that they love their country or that they are proud of it? In the United States, when people say they love or are proud of their country, they often think of such things as George Washington, the American Revolution, World War II, and so on. In Germany, people saying the same thing do most decidedly not, or only very rarely, think of Bismarck, the Franco-Prussian War, or Frederick the Great, not to mention Wilhelm II. They tend to focus more on such things as the country's exports, its regional cuisine, and the always ubiquitous Goethe. These things are naturally less controversial, or at least stir less violent passions, than do wars and political leaders, accepting my own strong distaste for the humorless Goethe. European pride and self-love are centered on smaller and more mundane things than are their American equivalents. There are differences, of course, among various West European countries. For example, political correctness, which feeds orcophobia, is a stronger force in the Anglo-Germanic than in the Latin countries, and there are a number of religious and socio-historical reasons for this. But in all countries of Western Europe, the Overton window is smaller than in the United States, leading to more widespread agreement in European cultures about what is good and what is bad. To put it somewhat exaggeratedly, everyone in Europe thinks the same way about so much. The window of accepted opinion is much smaller there than here in the United States, and so there is consequently less room for conflict between left and right. Those who try to continue the tenacious fight in favor of older traditions in Europe barely exist anymore, while in America that resistance is still very strong. In Europe, to the untrained eye, relative harmony and cultural self-love therefore appear to be the norm. Again, intra-European differences do exist, naturally, and what is socially acceptable in one European country may not be so in another. But regional differences notwithstanding, there is a striking uniformity in Western Europe in that genuine conservatism has collapsed almost everywhere, and traditionally conservative parties in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere are not worthy of the name. For instance, in Germany, all state governors agreed with the federal government in cracking down on freedom during the COVID lockdowns, while in the United States, there were still many conservative governors who resisted such measures. And during my most recent stay in Sweden, as that country was preparing for its last parliamentary election, I was struck, but not surprised, by how similar the campaign sloganeering was across all the parties. Little tidbits like, for Sweden's best, and together we can make our Sweden better, and let's get a handle on Sweden, made it difficult to guess which party was which, whereas anyone who knows the slightest thing about American politics would immediately be able to conclude whether a particular slogan or campaign commercial came from the Republicans or from the Democrats. Europeans who have been jaded by years of pointless political bickering always throw up their hands in exasperation and declare that the parties are basically all the same and that it doesn't really matter who accedes to political power in their countries. The new presidents or prime ministers will at most tinker around the edges, but almost everything will continue more or less as before. And so Europeans often wonder why Americans would fight their political battles as fiercely as we do, not realizing that here in the United States, it actually makes a great deal of difference in the lives of ordinary people who is in power on the federal, state, and local levels. And this is, again, because a much broader range of opinion is represented here, which means that a far broader range of policy options are on the table here than in Europe. Historically speaking, the reason behind these two different states of affairs is that the United States still finds itself in its great power phase, while Europe does not. That is to say, Americans are in this respect at an earlier historical stage than Europeans. Oikophobia, or cultural self-rejection, has already conquered in Europe and has already placed so many traditional opinions out of bounds, while the United States, as any great Western power in history, is bustling with all different kinds of opinions and counter-opinions, and is consequently much livelier in its political discourse. The back-and-forth political victories of left-wing and right-wing blocs in Europe mask the fact that their ultimate policies are not that different from each other, as well as the fact that genuine conservatives in Europe have already lost. This makes political discussion more innocuous in Europe than in America, and conveys the impression that Europeans are not as oikophobic as Americans are. But this is false, because in Europe, the oikophobes have already won. And this is indeed what happens when a society exits its great power phase. It becomes focused on the small, on the innocuous, and on the merely therapeutic. Whereas American sociopolitical discourse offers us the full gamut of possible opinions, from one extremism to the other, Europeans, even on opposite sides of their own political spectra, are much closer to each other. And this relative innocuousness is due to the fact that in Western Europe, the great historical battles have already been waged and settled. The United States finds itself in a phase of its historical development where Western Europe used to be, but is no longer. This is part of the reason, in addition to the American character being louder and more rambunctious in general, why the ideological battle in America is so much fiercer than in Europe, and why its Overton window, and therefore spirited debate, is broader. If we looked back 100 years on the European continent, we would find the same ferocity there as we now see here in the United States. But in Europe, the battle has already been settled, and oikophobia largely won, whereas in America, it is still ongoing. And so if one digs deep and truly begins to understand European ways of thinking, one will see how genuinely oikophobic Europeans actually are. But since there's already widespread agreement about much of the history and traditions that oikophobia has rejected, the people in Western Europe come across as more agreeable to one another and, paradoxically, as less in the grip of cultural self-contempt. And so oikophobic Europeans may appear to like their countries more than oikophobic Americans do, because the former have already changed their countries into something that it is easier for them to like, away from their older traditions, like the French revolutionaries who patriotically waved the tricolore after the revolution, after they had already changed everything. This is in contrast to the United States, where the conservative resistance to such change is still intense. That resistance then leads to a ramping up even further of American oikophobic rage and cultural self-contempt. I hope this all clarifies a point that has been repeatedly raised to me. And on a more cheerful note, I wish everyone watching this a very happy and productive 2023. Thank you for watching.